All right, guys, here's another training video on officer safety. Um, I did employ armed officers and unarmed officers, but I did supply this training to them so they can have an understanding that the profession can be at times dangerous. Um, so if you're in private security, just be aware of that and try to make yourself as safe as possible. So I'm hoping that this video will illustrate that principle to you. And here you go.
My approach to officer safety may be a little different than what you're accustomed to. I deal in realistic things the officer is going to be required to perform on the job on a daily basis. I don't believe in training people in areas they may never have to use, such as repelling or combative techniques, when the officer realistically is required to go out and perform the job and do it safely, and these tactics or techniques will never become part of that job. Now, one thing I like to explain to officers right up front is that when we joined this profession, we agreed to do a certain thing, and that is we agreed to provide protective services to either a community, a corporation, a business, whatever. And that means that as a result of providing this protective services, we have to draw a balance between job performance and officer safety. The balance has to consist of not officer safety nor job performance being the most paramount thing. They both have to balance each other. The officer cannot go out there and effectively perform the job without considering officer safety, and yet the officer can't have officer safety as the most paramount thing on his mind. In that case, I think the job would suffer. Now, my understanding about officer safety has always dealt with understanding what training really means. Training is providing the officer with concepts and techniques that will permit them to either change their behavior or improve their behavior. I've never seen training that allows an officer to digress in behavior. Now, to me, training has to be relevant. It has to be something the officer can apply on a daily basis. And the most important thing is it has to be current. Now, I've been in a lot of training classes and training courses, and what I've found is that in some of these training courses, I have had people trying to teach me techniques that have been, to be quite frank, very outdated. If you're going to provide a person with training, and that training is going to be current and up to date, it pretty much has to be done by, in my mind, a practitioner, and that is someone who does this job on a daily basis, so the person has a unique understanding of what the officer is going to be confronted with and provide training and techniques that the officer can combat or at least overcome any type of officer safety issue they may become involved in. Current is one of the most important factors. Also, you need to know who's providing the training. In my mind, if you're going to have someone come and train personnel, I don't care whether it's in combative techniques, whether it's in officer safety or job performance, whatever it may be, that person has to be reliable and that person has to be a professional within that individual field. You can't have someone who does this on a part-time basis or does it infrequent to be the trainer. One of the most important things about the individual who's doing the training, you need to know who they are, what is their background, what is their level of experience, their training, their education, all these different aspects about this individual so that you can pretty much judge whether or not this person is qualified to teach this course. And to be honest, if the person is not qualified to teach the course, I don't think they should be there in the first place. Now, I grant you that's a rather direct statement, but as I said before, I've been involved in training classes where I don't think the individual really possessed the current knowledge and skills to be training existing police officers or security officers and how to safely protect themselves in the field. To me, that's an exceptionally important point. Now, one of the things you might want to consider about on-the-job performance, we have a tendency to do so, and I think it's something we have to be very aware of, and that's relaxing too soon. Now, we go out in the field and contact someone. They may be agitated or irritated, whatever the case may be, and after a short period of time, we start to become too lax. We all of a sudden develop an opinion that, well, this person no longer presents a threat to me or a hazard, and the next thing you know, we start getting too close to him, we start becoming too friendly with him, and what we're doing is we're opening ourselves up for some real serious problems, because I grant you, I can't tell what's on your mind, you can't tell what's on mine. So it's important for us to always maintain this distance and this balance. To me, the distance is roughly 2.5 arm lengths away. And also, I position myself a little bit offset to the individual's weak side. Now, in most cases, the average human being is right-handed. Therefore, I position myself a little bit to the person's left, and I'm roughly 2.5 arm lengths away. That's my safety zone. I practice it and I follow it all the time. Now, this concept about looking at and being able to watch a person's eyes. Well, I'm not trying to be funny when I say this, but I've never been kicked by somebody's eyes before. But I do know if I don't position myself properly, that individual can certainly come at me, and what I want, if that does occur, I don't want the person to be able to come directly at me. He's either going to have to come at me at an angle, and that's going to place him at a little bit of a disadvantage. So remember, offset yourself roughly 2.5 arm lengths away. The reason for the distance, by the way, is so you can see that person's entire body. All right, remember one thing about officer safety as well, is that I grant you, you go on the job and work for 8 hours. You can't tell me that at the end of that 8 hours you are just as sharp as you were when you first started. Now, add a little factor to that. You work 4 additional hours worth of overtime. Well, you're still functional, I grant you, but at the end of that 12-hour shift, you can't tell me that your effectiveness and your abilities have certainly decreased over that last 4 hours. Now, some officers make a real big mistake, and they work double shifts. Now, you look at yourself at 8 o'clock in the morning as an example when you started. You're pretty sharp, you've had a good night's rest and everything else. I think you're pretty functional. Then look at yourself at noon. You've been on the job 4 hours, and depending upon the activity level, you start to slow down a little bit. And again, we get to the 8-hour shift. After the 8 hours, you can certainly see that you're not as sharp as you were in the beginning. And I said, you tack on the additional 4 hours, and you see that your performance level is greatly reduced. Now, you add that extra 4 hours on top of it, which represents that double shift, and I grant you, all they have out there working is a body. Because you're not sharp, you're not functional, you're not paying attention to what you're supposed to be doing, and a lot of officers have been hurt and injured as a result of not getting enough rest and trying to extend their hours by working double shifts. I know that the money's good, and that's usually the reason for it is economics, but sometimes economics has to take a back seat to officer safety. Be very careful about that, and if you have to, you have to, but don't make it a regular routine basis, because I think you're going to lose in the long run. Now, attitude. What does attitude have to do with officer safety? Attitude has a tremendous amount to do with it. You look at the officer who has a negative attitude about the job himself and every other aspect, and what do you find? You find an employee or an individual who does less than quality work. In fact, if you sit back and watch this individual without him knowing it, I think what you're going to see is a person who barely scratches the surface of minimal acceptable standards of performance. Because why? It takes time and energy and effort for a person to be squared away, pay attention to what they're doing, all these different aspects of the job, especially the focus and the clarity. That person has to know what's going on around him and pay attention to it. Now that means the person has to concentrate and focus. I grant you, if a person doesn't like what he's doing, has a bad attitude about the job and everything else, you tell me how that person is going to be sharp and always be ready, or at least be able to perform the job in a safe manner. I don't think it's going to happen. I'll reemphasize this again. A person with a negative attitude is not going to be the safest officer out there in the street. And if you find one that is, we're going to bottle him, because that's going to be a unique find, I grant you. Now, failure to observe or identify danger signs. Now, there's certain times out there that you need to be a little bit aggressive, you need to be a little bit more forceful than normal, but those times are rather rare. The normal situation is you come in contact with somebody, they may or may not disagree with what you're trying to tell them to do, but that's not the time to use an aggressive attitude or an aggressive demeanor. Because what you're going to do is you're going to cause this person's danger signs to elevate. And by doing that, you're not going to be paying attention to what the individual does, and the next thing you know, that person is all over you, because why? You talk that individual into being aggressive against you. Recognize certain signs with people. We talked about it in conflict resolution. It is, see what the individual looks like when you first come in contact with them. If the person is obviously upset and angry, that is not the time to start using direction and control to get the person to comply with what you want them to do. Step back a little bit, use your verbal skills, use your communication techniques, and talk to this individual and get them to calm down before you all of a sudden have to switch into some form of director role or whatever the case may be. If the person is obviously upset, back off, try your verbal skills. Don't walk into that individual and say, hey, here's what I want you to do and I want you to do it. Because what you're going to do is that represents a challenge. This person may not be ready to accept that challenge, and that person may lash out at you, and that's something you don't want to happen, because I grant you, you can certainly talk an individual into becoming very aggressive with you. Okay, one thing about officer safety that I think a lot of officers really fail to understand, or at least remember, and that is you have limitations. Now, we all have limitations, and a lot of times we forget those. Now, from the aspect of physical fitness, that is a limitation. Now, we start this job out at 21 or 22 or 23 years old, and we can pretty much go out and do what we want because we have the physical skills and the stamina to perform the job. Now, once we're on this job for 15 or 20 years, we don't have the same level of physical fitness, and we certainly don't have the same stamina. Now, that's where our education, training, and skills come into play. That is, we use our training and we use our experience to offset maybe the disadvantage of not having the physical skills or the physical stamina we used to have. Think about it. Common sense says, I'm not going to chase an 18-year-old down the street because I better hope I don't catch him. Because if I've been on this job 20 years or so and I'm 40 some odd and this person's 18, I grant you their physical stamina is a lot better than mine. So common sense comes into play there. I may not want to try that. I may want to, as an example, call for assistance. By the way, I've never seen an 18-year-old outrun Motorola yet. It doesn't make sense. Don't try to take on something physically impossible for you to do. At least consider that, because one of the things we find is that a lot of officers are hurt and injured because they fail to remember that they are no longer as physically fit as they used to be. Now let's look at physical fitness. I don't know what to tell people. I don't know what to say, okay, if you run 6 miles a day, that's going to accomplish the level of physical fitness that's necessary. I don't know. I do know this, that the average physical altercation that you have with a person ranges anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute and a half. Let's use that as an example. Now, if you're going to develop a level of physical fitness, then you don't want to develop it just to a minute and a half stamina. You may want to at least double that. So when you start a physical fitness program, look at it from the standpoint, I need to be able to build my stamina up to at least a 3-minute level. And that means I can actually physically hold on to someone, physically restrain them, or get involved in a combative situation that hopefully will not last up to 3 minutes. If you try anything less than that, I think you're going to have a real serious problem. So whatever physical fitness level will permit you to have a stamina of at least up to and including 3 minutes, I think that may be the safest way to look at it. And again, I'm not going to say what it is because I personally don't know. And you're going to have to figure that out. And again, I hate to say it this way, but I think the majority of us should probably go out and have a medical examination to determine what type of physical fitness we can become involved in before we actually get into it. Okay, at least consider these things. The safest officer is going to be the officer that uses common sense. Common sense will dictate to you what you should and should not do in many cases. And I use the example of chasing the 18-year-old and when you're 45. Common sense says, I'm not going to be effective here. In fact, if I do catch this individual, I'm probably going to have a hard time controlling that individual. Why? Because he has a much higher level of physical fitness than I do. Use your common sense, use your skills, and I think in the long run you're going to find that training, education, and experience is going to be your best tool and resource. Be safe out there, but think about it in the process.